Thank you all very much for coming out. I'm excited to introduce Chris Charteris, who is a graduating tomorrow senior, Saturday, senior from the Department of Social Sciences at Michigan Technological University, a degree in anthropology, a bachelor's degree. I'm delighted to kind of see Chris kind of make this journey. He's been in almost every class I teach, I think, from Europe to a science fiction course to the most recent course on industrial communities, which I can see a lot of that kind of coming out in here. And so just kind of delighted to see kind of Chris make this journey. This is the senior thesis presentation for our graduating seniors in the anthropology degree. Kind of unlike maybe a master's or definitely a PhD kind of thesis that's written, this is really a student's kind of first independent kind of foray into research, where I was advisor, I helped out, moving drafts, pointing in the direction of different data, different sources, but this is really kind of Chris's kind of first crack at trying to okay, how do I answer some of these big questions and how do I go about doing that? And so we really kind of let our students kind of explore in that space, and this is the result of that exploration. So without further ado, Chris Charteris and the abandoned rails and distant roads.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you, Elise. Good evening, folks. I just want to thank you all for coming to this presentation. So we have a little bit of schedule for our presentation. Let's start out with some acknowledgements I want to make real quick. Then we want to get into the background, look at some of the big picture ideas that sort of frames my work here, look at some of the general information about the region, and then start getting into sort of the timeline of transit in the region and look at the history. So a big part of my research is the question of transit access and how that can be quantified, and we'll get into talking about that. Have some discussion about the results, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So if you're here in person, please hold your questions until the end. If you're on Zoom, we will read out your questions at the end, so you can put those in the chat while we are going through, or you can put them in the chat when we get to the question section at the end. I'd like to acknowledge that Michigan Technological University is located within Ojibwe homelands and ceded territory established by the Treaty of 1842. Firstly, I'd also like to acknowledge the Carnegie Museum of the Keweenaw and Elise Nelson for hosting this talk. I'd like to acknowledge the Copper Country Historical Collections at Michigan Tech Archives for access to the archival materials that made up the backbone of the work that I've done. All the images in this presentation would come from the Copper Country Historical Images, which are also provided by the Michigan Tech Archives. And I'd like to thank Dr. Mark Rhodes for advising on this research. Gave me a lot of guidance on getting through this. So to start with a bit of background, this entire period that I'm looking at, 1920 to 2020, is sort of a big transition period for the copper country. It's when deindustrialization really happens here. Deindustrialization is, generally speaking, the process of a region's primary economic activity moving away from industry and moving towards something else. The copper country was moving away from mining very heavily post-World War II. Some of that happened before the war during the Depression. And roughly the halfway point period I'm looking at, 1970, is pretty much when most of the mining activity up here came to an end. And that's sort of the backdrop for this 100 years of transportation that I'm looking at. So just some discussion on the routes. So the railroad routes, primarily for east-west service, were offered by the South Shore and Atlantic. That can get you to Duluth, that can get you to Sault Ste. Marie, that's how you get to Marquette. And the primary route we want to be looking at is the Milwaukee Railroad route that was a transfer route from the Copper Range Railroad. So you would get on the train down at the West Houghton waterfront, and you make your way to McKeever Junction, where you transfer over to a Milwaukee rail train that takes you the rest of the way to Chicago. I'm also going to be looking at Trans Central Airlines, which was a airline company that's operating in the region in the 1970s, and they got merged into a bunch of other stuff with all the mergers of data trackable that happened. So the sort of these are 6 sort of selected dates that I've chosen to just sort of demonstrate the depth of information that sort of happens here, and some of these are sort of key periods of change within how transit is done, and sort of key points to know. So in 1920, in a starting year, the North Country Limited, which is the train route I was talking about that went from Houghton down to McKeever, transferred with Milwaukee Rail to get you down to Chicago, had just resumed service. It was suspended during World War I and the immediate post-war era in favor of the other routes of the region. Then in 1943, there was actually a hearing held at the Houghton Courthouse by the Interstate Commerce Commission, the Houghton Public Service, the Michigan Public Service Commission, which looked at the poor quality of rail travel in the region. In 1947, the Houghton County Memorial Airport opens, but commercial flights don't start there until 1951. By the early 70s, passenger rail travel in the region comes to an end. And in 2009, Delta Airlines sought to get essential status for their flights operating to Houghton. So to get into the methodology of how I came to answer my question for data understanding here, I started with archival research, right? Lots of files and data that can just be pulled out the archives. It's a great resource. And so split this data into 3 primary sections. Quantitative data, that gets you your real timetables and your ticket prices and stuff like that. Qualitative data, that's talking about sort of the experience of travel. That's your the trains were delayed again, and this is constantly happening, and how are people supposed to tolerate this? And then context data, that's your start and end dates, that's the sort of the bigger picture, just the general dates and stuff like that. And so the quantitative data that was used through historical geographic information systems to map it out on onto historical maps, and that can be used to do the access calculations I did and then visualize the qualitative data. There's a methodology called context analysis, which is used in order to identify trends and commonalities amongst a body of material, and that helps to sort of understand what the general lived experiences were. If people are talking a lot about how this weather delays causing problems, probably weather delays were a big part of the lived experience. And then taking this visualization and lived experience and the context, we can compare those together in order to come to the knowledge of the subject. So let's get into the lived experience. We're going to start with trains. Most of this is relevant to the 1920s, but there's discussion throughout the period that sort of contributes to the knowledge here. So first we're talking about very long routes. 15+ hours to Chicago could take up to 20 hours to get to Sault Ste. Marie, about 15 hours to get to Duluth. Not exactly very quick. There's only normally 1 train a day on each of those routes, so you have to travel at a specific time and sit on the train for however long. And several of the routes, including the Milwaukee Rail routes, didn't have any meal service on board, so you're going to be on board for 15 hours if everything goes according to plan, with only the food you can bring. There's an article in the Daily Mind Gazette in 1943 that was mentioning that there maybe should be food service on these trains. Patrons have stayed up have to stay aboard for nearly 15 hours without eating facilities. Discrimination is charged. The 400, a streamliner operated by a competitor, provides food on its run from Chicago to Ishmael. So there's definitely some contention that, well, if they can get food service, why aren't we getting it up here? So there's also frequent delays in weather systems, right? It was 15 hours, assuming everything was going well. It could be much longer than that. The train could be canceled, they might just never show up and they might never tell you. I mean, it was so bad that again, the Interstate Commerce Commission came in and had a hearing on what the experience was like, and sort of getting into the nitty-gritty. The weather is obviously a big contributing factor, but the winters up here are also so harsh that the material of the railroad itself would be damaged over the winter, so there would also be a very long repair season through the spring and summer that would also cause delays. And in general, there's a decline of service availability throughout the 50s and 60s. When this hearing was happening in 1947, a report in the Calumet and Heckler newsletter stated, passenger service on all lines operating into the upper country will be scrutinized at the hearing. The late arrival of trains in this district has been a problem to travelers for years. Travel time between this area and Chicago has been longer than similar distances over other lines. Obviously, in the 40s, the airline, the airport opened this, and not just be one regular flight. So this, what's the lived experience of flying? Well, there's inconsistent service to destinations throughout history. Environments change, which cities they fly to change pretty consistently. There's very consistent weather delays. I mean, anyone who's tried flying out of Houghton knows that there's probably going to be a weather delay at least once. And then because there's changing airline providers, there's periods of service pretty regularly where there aren't any flights available. And national strikes affect the service as well. From a September 1998 story in the Daily Mining Gazette. The people up here need service. From what I've heard, people have been driving to Minneapolis and different places in Wisconsin to get flights out. That doesn't make any sense. And that has to do with the Northwest Airlines strike that happened that year. So, Cour's. So, Cour travel took a bit longer to take off in this region due to remoteness and the poor roads. But during the Great Depression, the Works Progress Administration, Brockway Mountain Drive was built. There's a lot of tourism going on. The interstate highway system obviously really helped expand travel to the Upper Peninsula in general, with the Mackinac Bridge within Michigan travel and the improved rail network in Wisconsin and Minnesota, so drawing more from that direction. A tourism brochure for the region in the 1930s said that thousands of people visited Keweenaw lands last year. Countless numbers were nomad vacationers. They came by way of smooth highways. They traveled light and led a leisurely vagabond life of the road. So obviously, traveling here by Cour was established in the 1930s, but it's definitely if you're leisurely travel, living a vagabond's life, that's how you get up here. So what does it look like today? Well, it's very Cour-centric, right? If you go onto Michigan Technological University's website, if you go onto Keweenaw National Historic Park's website, both of them say, if you want to get up here, here's how to drive. Michigan Tech, if you go further down the page, they do mention air service and the bus service. The Keweenaw National Historical Park does not. And air travel continues to face many of the same issues. There's one review of the Houghton County Memorial Airport that says that someone was trying to get up here and 13 flights in a row were delayed or canceled. And And actually, the long distance bus like this here, the Indian Trails out of Milwaukee, is technically an extension of the rail service, not its own independent bus service. Of the Amtrak system. So let's get into the more number side of things. Transit access. So what is access? Access is the difficulty to use a service, system, or location. So if you're living here in Houghton, the difficulty to get to another city would be can be quantified as its access. And the way of quantifying it is through a combination of the distance and the time to reach the destination. A higher number means less accessible. This is useful to compare across a single method of transportation. If you're taking the train in the 1920s, which city is the easiest to get to? And it's useful to compare a single city across time. When was it easiest to get to Chicago? So starting out with the railroad routes in the 1920s, you can see that getting to Chicago is the most difficult place to get to. It's quite a long journey. It's quite a distance. And many of the cities, Green Bay and Iron Mountain, you're passing through on the way. Sioux St. Mary and Dubuque are also pretty difficult to get to, as well as the extremes. This is generally intuitive. The places that are closer are easier to get to. But it's it's worth knowing, how much easier it is to get to Marquette than it is to Iron Mountain, for instance. And you can sort of get the feeling of how difficult it is to get as you go further afield. Moving on to air travel, you see a very different sort of distribution. Marquette and Iron Mountain are obviously the easiest to get to with the Trans Central Airlines flight pattern in the 1970s, because you have the two direct flights out of Houghton or to Marquette and to Iron Mountain. So pretty much getting to the south, you're going to those two locations. Not too bad to get to them. Green Bay, again, if you go to Iron Mountain, take a hop to Green Bay, not that bad. You can take a hop from Green Bay to Chicago. Duluth is a bit higher because you have to go to Green Bay and then back up to Duluth. And Sault Ste. Marie is very difficult to go to. You have to fly to Marquette and then to Esplanade and then to Traverse City and then to Sault Ste. Marie. That's about transfers. Keep in mind too, at this time, the 1970s, the timetable said to make sure you show up for your flight at least 10 minutes early. That's changed quite a bit. So this is sort of the driving cost now. This is in 2020. So it's still fairly intuitive. It's quite similar to the rail cost. Chicago is quite a distance away, but you do notice that that Chicago is much higher relatively than Sault Ste. Marie and Duluth. As that's being factored a lot more than by distance than by time. So comparing across these, the main thing to remember with these comparisons is that since we're comparing across method of transportation and time and different cities, that you have to take everything with a little bit of a grain of salt here. There's quite a bit of variation that can be accounted for here, but it sort of gives you the general idea of sort of what air travel did, and it made it much more efficient to go to the hub cities. While rail travel and driving, you have to go in between everything. It's the closer you are, the easier it is. But what about money? Right? Because obviously the only thing affecting whether you're traveling isn't just the ticket cost, it isn't just how far you're going and how long it's going to get there. The ticket cost is quite important. And this sort of tells a different story. Now then, Ticket prices are unfortunately not well reported through the early railroad period. Oftentimes they would be announced in newspapers, which if you go to the ticket office, you'll be charged whatever they charged you, and that would be information that would be kept by the railroad and not widely posted. So a lot of that is lost to, at least in my limited local research. But you can see that generally, and this is all normalized to what $1 was worth on January 1st, 2020. The rail is actually much cheaper than driving or flying. And flying can be quite pricey at times. Especially Sault Ste. Marie, since you're taking all those hops, presumably. Now, if you factor in the money as a sort of part of the cost of the rail, it does tell a different story. It tells a story where driving to Marquette and flying to Marquette is not all that different as far as cost. And you can also see that, again, Sault Ste. Marie, flying to Sault Ste. Marie is quite a bit different. But you can also see the sort of efficiency coming in with these sort of direct routes to Chicago and hub cities, with just how Chicago is so much more accessible. There's another thing that's not really being shown by the quantitative data that you can find through the qualitative research I did. Inconsistent service, weather cancellations, the quality of the experience. Are you going to sit on a train for 15 hours filming the food you brought with you? All of that is not factored into that moment. For a lot of people, that's probably why Charteris is such a tempting offer now. That's a lot of why the Cour-centric model has become so prevalent, because you're not reliant on the weather cancellation for whether or not you can go. You can stop and get food when you want. But there's other costs as well. The environmental, flying everywhere isn't exactly the most pollution-friendly option. And obviously tax spending that goes into the road system and the air system and the railroad system. All of those are not factored into the cost at all. And also the costs related to a personal code. Well, theoretically speaking, the model I used, which was the IRS tax calculation for per mileage costs, is more or less accurate. You know, you might have an older car that has worse fuel efficiency. You might have a car that needs more maintenance costs. You know, if you have a car that has 300,000 miles on it, you probably don't want to drive that all the way to Chicago. So, what does this tell us? It tells us that the model suggests that air travel is generally the most accessible if your concerns are time. In some cases, Sault Ste. Marie, driving is more accessible, but the fiscal cost is split between the two models, but both are more expensive than rail travel was, where we have information available. So this sort of tells us the sort of wide amount of information, right? That obviously it's a very different environment that we're traveling in now than we were 100 years ago. And there's a lot more accessibility now with driving options and stuff like that. But it also sort of tells us about the nature of the remoteness of this region being related to what options we have available to us. So obviously driving sort of offers that higher individual freedom that I mentioned. The driver gets a lot more choice than if you're riding on a plane or taking a train. And also I suspect that the model that I used is probably overly favoring air travel due to its speed and general directness. So in future work, just a lot more depth of information, a lot more timetables, more information on ticket prices. That Interstate Commerce Commission here, they would have written down everything everyone said, all the complaints about the rail travel, and anyone who really liked the rail travel, I assume, would have talked about it. So unfortunately, that's not in the archives up here, that's probably in the archives in Lansing, on the East Coast somewhere. So getting that sort of information will be very useful for understanding much more fully difficulties experienced with that travel. And then there's, there's other stuff going on, histories of people talking about their experience traveling and all that stuff. And using an improved model that weighs the different factors so that being fast isn't the only consideration, and that adds in the hidden costs. Is this a method of transit that's more likely to be delayed? Is it more likely, is it less enjoyable experience? Is it a more difficult experience? All that needs to be factored in. Another way that this work can be expanded is to put it into a wider network with more destination cities. Connecting it out onto the coasts would be very interesting, because obviously the immigrants that came to work in the mines here were coming primarily from the coasts. So how difficult was it for them to get to this location and to pursue the work in the mining industry up here, as well as other industries up here? And if they decided that they wanted to leave and work something else, how difficult was that to do? And factoring, another part of that would be factoring ticket pricing in based on regional wages rather than inflation. Like, we can say that, the railroad ticket to Chicago would cost $145 in today's money. But what does that actually mean for someone who's working in the mines up here at that time? And that's information that is becoming more available as other projects in the region are working on digitizing employment records in the mines, working on creating this real vibrant depth of information on the people who lived up here in the past. And that's something that would really add to this sort of work. Any questions? Back?
Yeah, so this is an urban legend, but was CMX Airport placed in the Keweenaw because the snow level was relatively high there, which helped maximize the state snow equipment?
I am not sure. I did not see anything referring to that, but most of the information that I got on the Memorial Airport was about the sort of funding for it and opening on it from official sources like the Daily Mining Gazette and from the Calumet and Heckler newsletter. So not someplace that they would record that sort of information.
Have you heard the rumor before?
No, I have not actually.
How do we get the Canadians to pay for that airport too?
That is something I was curious about, because I did notice in the actual opening, the Canadian Air Force was present, as well as the US Army Air Force, which is something I wasn't expecting. Those are good questions that would be interesting to look into more.
Very nice presentation, nice work. I've been reading a book about people taking the rail lines from the other direction, Great Migration of African Americans moving up to the industrial north and the coast and so forth. So it made me wonder, like, in this period of industrialization in the UP, like, who was taking that rail line down? Were they also drawn to the jobs in Chicago and Milwaukee and things like that as the mines were kind of slowing down? Or do you have a sense of like who was taking these trains?
So
that route.
yeah, so that's something that would be shown by the Calumet and Heckler employment code records, because they kept track of any company who sent a letter back to the mining company asking for a reference or anything like that on the employee's employment code. I worked on a project to transcribe those, so I know that I saw a lot who were heading down to Detroit and out west as well. But since I haven't seen all of them and that data is still being aggregated and looked at, that's a question that hopefully in a couple of years there's going to be a much firmer answer to.
I would think that expanding it to both the trains to Detroit and then the airlines to Detroit and maybe Minneapolis would be a benefit, because I remember when I first, moved up here, you had to take the plane, one flight was from here in Minneapolis and then to Detroit, and then other various ones to Detroit before they started going to here in Chicago.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of history of the destinations changing around. If I had a lot more time to work on this, I'd really love to do every 5 years or even every single year and look at how the network changed in that sort of very fine scale of that year by year changes instead of really just choosing essentially every 50 years as I looked at the sort of limited scope research.
What organization is doing the transcribing of the Parliament Club records?
So that's the QAnon Time Traveler is working with that, and that was funded by the Council of Libraries and Information.
Yeah, you look at the past and the reasons for travel and the need for travel. And now you look at today, 2023, you've got Zoom, you've got email, you've got texting. Do you think there's going to be different patterns of travel based on need and reason to travel?
So I definitely think that's going to be something that we're going to see looked at more and more. Part of the reason that I chose January 1st, 2020 as my end date for research is because of how much COVID-19 coming to the US affected so many aspects of our lives, including how we traveled and why we traveled and all that sort of stuff. So I think that definitely there's going to be a lot of interesting research that's coming out over the next few years and probably for a long time looking at those sorts of changes.
I was also thinking too that maybe going a little bit farther back, it's my impression that historically the railroad routes, I just found out recently, I don't think there was a road from here to Marquette until the 1910s or the teens sometime, and the trains were going around. You could get on a train and go from here to Canada in the 1880s.
Yeah, that's definitely something, moving further back would also be something quite interesting, but the further back we move, it just becomes much harder to get records. In the actual historical archives, there's only a handful of railroad timetables available, and none of them were available from before 1920. So that becomes a matter of data availability. But if the data was available, that would be really great to look at, and sort of a much bigger project could look at a lot of people's stories of growing up here and oral histories and stuff to try to sort of backtrace that. And I think that would be an interesting place for a project like this to go to.
The branch line you might have looked at, but I didn't know that they didn't have any food service on the Milwaukee Road. Did you find out, whether that was quite rare? Because you hear about buffet cars from the 1880s onwards, but were they the rarity? And on service lines normal?
So it seems like it was very rare that the service to the coffee country didn't have meals. It seemed like pretty much, I listed the one competing railroad route to Ishpeming, but there's a lot of others that were listed to Escanaba, to even the other trains that terminated around Iron Mountain did have dinosaur cars. It was only the ones that went all the way up here that didn't.
My husband's been probably embarrassed that I said this. Your senior class trip from Valley took the train to Chicago, and you said you
No, took the train to Milwaukee,
Milwaukee,
and then we bused from Milwaukee to Chicago.
and there was no food service on it at that point.
So you're listing a lot of kind of things you wish you had in the archives. If you could like magically have one data set here for this project for doing it, like what would be the one thing you summon?
It would be zero ticket prices because there's a lot more timetables available than there are ticket information available. And so when I first was coming into this and looking at setting this project up last fall, so I really wanted to integrate the ticket price factor, and that's something I wasn't able to fully integrate due to the lack of data available on
Were you able to look at, or is there any way to have access to maybe the number of trips taken by each mode? I don't know if like for car travel and not keeps those records, but you know, how many car trips are taken between here and Marquette or Hillary, and then you know, obviously rail, how many people actually travel on the rail on those routes or air travel?
So that's something that probably would have been recorded in some way, probably by the Interstate Commerce Commission. So that'd be something going out to the Interstate Commerce Commission archives in the DC area and just doing a lot of digging through paperwork and tax reports and stuff like that. So it's definitely something that'd be possible, but that'd be a very big project to do.
What about passenger ships? Were there any ships that ran to the loop or?
So that's something that I was looking into because I know that there was passenger ships available. I'm not sure if it's something that just existed before my era, or if it's just since a lot of the shipping companies are so much more separated from the region. With the Michigan Tech Archives, we're really lucky to have pretty much all of the mining companies archives, and therefore a lot of the videos that reach with the mining companies have some records that have ended up at the Copper Country Historical Collections. I'm not sure if it's just that sort of information has ended up elsewhere with the in whatever cities the shipping companies are headed up in, and a lot of them are probably still around, so they might be holding on to those records themselves. Or if by 1920 passenger travel on ships was becoming a lot less common. That's another very good question too. That'd be nice to be able to follow up on.
I know the passenger ships were running up, probably even to the 60s.
Okay.
That they were somewhere in Ohio, Detroit, usually. Yeah, South American, North American, and there are a bunch of others, and they go from here to the loop and back.
That's
From downstate, from somewhere in Ohio.
That's very good to know, and that's something that just through doing other type of work I wasn't really able to come across. So thank you.
Did you see a correlation of the industrial use of railroads compared to the passenger traffic? I mean, did one affect the other, or because and you kind of started where things were in a downturn?
Yeah, so that's definitely something that I would suspect, and that's something that there are definitely newspaper articles, even going back into like the 80s when they're talking about the limited rail service up here and the limited transportation that makes that correlation. And I will say that there's definitely a lot more rail options available in the 1920s, which was sort of the last really major period of mining activity up here before the Great Depression. There's a lot more service then, and definitely as following World War II, the mining activity went down. So did the rail transport opportunity. But that's also correlated with a lot of other factors, just the general downturn in rail service across the country sort of then, and the predominance of the automobile sort of goes up then. So it'll be it's definitely something that can be looked into, and with a lot more data and a lot more time, I think that sort of correlation could potentially be made, but I can't say for sure that there is a correlation. Any questions on the Zoom? Yeah. Oh, thank you all.
I do have a question.
Okay.
It's the first one. Are you planning to continue your education in this area?
So for right now, I'm going to be just entering the workforce, but I plan to come back to get my I plan to return to academia and get graduate degrees at some point, whether that's up here or somewhere else in the country. I'm leaving open, but this is definitely an area that I'm personally interested in and very passionate about. So I could see myself continuing in this area, and something that I think is definitely an important area of research.